We just watched some historic movement for crypto legislation on Capitol Hill. Let's talk about the two bills that made it through committee first. You have the FIT 21 Act, which sort of focuses on registration of crypto assets with the CFTC and SEC. There's also the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, which sort of addresses how miners are considered money transmitters. Is this really the clarity that people have been asking for?
Well, I think this is a huge step towards regulatory clarity here in the United States. I've spoken quite a bit about how while the rest of the world is kind of seeing a crypto spring a little bit come back, we're kind of stuck in permafrost here in the United States. And this reflects, I think, a definite thawing. Now, the critical thing I think to note is that these were bipartisan backed bills, and that's really important. Does it bode well for what happens next, both a House floor vote and a Senate vote? We'll have to see. But it's really important to note that this wasn't just Republican-backed work. And that was something that I think a lot of critics of crypto were saying. This is a super partisan issue. That's just proven to not be the case. In terms of addressing regulatory clarity, look, there's a lot of work to do, but these lay a really good foundation for future work and future discussions. And the fact that these both got through is a historic moment. There's no question about that here in the United States.
Yeah, I do want to ask about how they sort of stack up in comparison to all of the movement we've seen around the world. I mean, you have MiCA, which is sort of considered the gold standard for how we're moving forward with regulatory clarity around the world. You have movement in the Middle East and in Hong Kong. How does this legislation, how do these pair of bills stack up in comparison to the movement we've been seeing around the world?
Well, they're not comprehensive the way that MiCA really is in Europe. And MiCA was a multi-year effort to bring together very diverse coalitions, different countries. The process there is if we think our process is tough, I mean, let me tell you. So the fact that that got done before anything moves in the United States is extremely telling in terms of the tenor, the tone towards this industry and the opportunity and how it's perceived. That being said, we have a different political system here. We have different priorities in this country, right? And so I do think that this set of bills really does focus on some of the critical issues that we've been dealing with here, namely, who has jurisdiction over the assets? How do we define the assets? What are we even talking about here in the first place, right? So those are kinds of fundamental questions I think these bills do address. There are always tweaks and changes, and things are going to move significantly as these carry forward. Regardless, I think it's kind of comparing apples and oranges, right? What MiCA was trying to do at a different time was broader, bigger, and kind of dispositively final. This is a step and a piece towards a bigger movement, I think, that we're seeing from Congress.
Yeah, you mentioned the bipartisanship in these bills. There is one area of contention still, I think that's very present this week, and that was with the stablecoin bill that stalled out in the House Financial Services Committee. There was a lot of debate over the bill. The chair of the committee, Patrick McHenry, sort of blamed the Biden administration for holding up that bill. What's driving the divide there? What are some of the pain points for getting stablecoin legislation across?
Yeah, so that one I think is tough. It's a shame. They were so close from everything we hear to really coming to an agreement on these things, and it was kind of a last minute change of direction. I think there are a couple issues that have been sticky for a while. One is the balance between the states and the federal regime. So how does a state regime around rules here actually play into this? And many of the Democrats are very supportive of the state regime here and want to see that continue to have a lot of power and voice. And that is a broader question, right? That reflects kind of the general partisan divide on those questions in some ways, in terms of how we want to see these things play out ultimately over time. I think that there's also some engagement from the White House. We heard from the news that came kind of in the last minute. And the idea that they were concerned about this, I think that is primarily about how a payment stablecoin would play against or on the backdrop of a central bank digital currency. I think there's also some desire to see FedNow, which launched very recently, have a little more time to percolate. In my view, those things are just unrelated. They really have nothing to do with payment stablecoins and specifically what this bill is trying to do. However, I think optically and in terms of the messaging, some of that stuff, I think got all jammed up together. Now we'll see what happens next. We're very close to kind of taking a summer recess. And so when we get back, there'll be renewed vigor on some of these topics, a lot of these topics, including, I think, renewed views and looks from the Senate. So we're going to have to see how this all plays out. But yeah, that was one that I think a lot of folks found disappointing, and not just folks in the crypto industry.
I can't let you go without asking about the SEC and its crackdown this year. We got the ruling in the Ripple case, which The Crypto Council actually filed an amicus brief in support of Ripple. What was your reaction to that ruling? That's what it means for the industry. I mean, it's not really a clear decision as to XRP's status as a security, but I mean, it did sort of take the wind out of the SEC sails.
I thought it was actually a quite nuanced and thoughtful order, and reflected that Judge Torres had done quite a bit of education herself and understanding the differences here. Quite sophisticated in my view. I think there's, again, a long process. We have to see how this all plays out, what appeals may be filed once the whole thing is finished, what Ripple decides to do, what the SEC decides to do. Does this even make it through? What happens after the election? Do we have the same folks, at the agencies? There's a lot of things that are going to change. So I think it's a bit premature to be doing anything predictive around this, but I think your point is the large one, which is the takeaway here is that the SEC cannot unilaterally decide what is or isn't a security. It's not a question for them to decide, especially in a place like digital assets, where there are a lot of aspects of these assets that simply do not fit into traditional model. They just don't. That is factual. What you want to do with that, you may decide, okay, great, I don't care, which seems to be Gary Gensler's stance, or you may say that's actually really important and critical, which is a lot of people's stances, including Ripple's in this case. So we filed an amicus because we really felt like that distinction was an important one, right? And to try to understand who gets to decide and how do we have to make rules here. We can't just have an agency that is suddenly saying any innovation is going to be ruled by, rules and laws that date to a completely different time. So I think that's a takeaway. I actually think the major thing that's going to happen there is congressional action. You see, I think the market structure bill in particular, I think got wind in its sails because of that ruling in part. It already had a lot of traction, don't get me wrong, but that certainly didn't hurt. And look, I think the critical thing here too to note is that we're just forget crypto and forget, zoom out, right? We're looking at a time right now where in the United States, there is a lot of discussion, very existential discussion about how do the three branches of government interact with each other? What is the role of the judiciary? What's the role of the legislature? And what's the role of the executive branch? And those things are shifting. They're shifting, slowly and kind of in tectonic ways, but we're getting caught up as a crypto industry in all of that. And that's important to note, right? Some of this just isn't about crypto. It's about these broader things that are happening as well.